Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out. Today's episode is one of those topics that looks simple on the surface, but once you start paying attention to how it's actually used, you realize there's a lot more going on.
Yeah, and this is something that almost every English learner struggles with at some point, even at the intermediate level, sometimes even advanced, because we're talking about two very common verbs, do and make.
Exactly. And the confusing part is, you already know both words. You've seen them hundreds of times. You understand them individually, but when it's time to actually use them in a sentence, you hesitate.
Yeah, and that hesitation usually sounds like this. Wait, is it do or make here? And sometimes you guess, and sometimes you get it right, but sometimes it sounds a little off.
And what makes this tricky is that both options often feel possible. It's not like one is obviously wrong.
Exactly. You might say something like, I did a mistake, and it makes sense. People understand you, but it doesn't sound natural.
Yeah, a native speaker would say, I made a mistake.
And that small difference is exactly what we're going to explore today. But we're not going to turn this into a grammar lesson, because that's usually where things get confusing.
Yeah, instead of rules, we're going to focus on patterns, on how people actually use, do, and make in real conversations. Because this is the key idea. English is not just about knowing words, it's about knowing how those words naturally connect.
Exactly. And once you start noticing those connections, you stop guessing and you start speaking more confidently.
Let's imagine a simple situation. You're talking about your day, and you want to say something like, I need to underscore my homework. And your brain pauses. Because both options exist.
Yeah, but the natural answer is, do my homework.
And if you say, I need to make my homework, it's understandable. But it sounds strange.
So today, we're going to break this down step by step and show you how to stop guessing and start feeling what sounds right.
Yeah, and by the end of this episode, you'll have a much clearer sense of when to use do and when to use make.
All right, let's start with something simple. So before we jump into examples, let's talk about the general idea behind these two verbs. Not rules, just a way to think about them. In a very simple way, do is usually about actions, tasks, or activities, things you perform, things you complete.
Yeah, things like do homework, do the dishes, do your job. These are things you execute. You're not creating something new. You're just doing the action. Now, make usually has the idea of creating something or producing a result. So you get things like make a cake, make money, make a decision.
Yeah, in all of these, something is being created, even if it's not something physical. But here's the important part. This idea helps, but it's not enough.
Exactly. Because there are many cases where the logic is not obvious.
And that's where learners get confused, because they try to apply logic, but English is not always logical.
So instead of trying to memorize rules, let's look at real examples. Because that's where things become clearer.
Yeah, once you see how people actually use these verbs, it starts to feel more natural. All right, let's go to the first group of examples. All right, so let's really slow this down and take a closer look at how do is actually used in real life. Because I think this is where things start to become clearer. Not when you memorize a definition, but when you start seeing the same pattern repeated in different situations. And once you see that pattern enough times, you stop thinking about rules, and it just starts to feel natural.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is especially true with do be, because do shows up a lot in everyday life. In the things you do every day. In routines, responsibilities, small tasks, things that are not necessarily exciting, but are part of normal life. So when we talk about devoir, we're usually talking about actions that you perform, not things you create, but things you complete, things you take care of.
Yeah, and that's why you see it in situations like do homework, do the dishes, do your job, do the laundry. All of these have something in common. They're tasks. They're things you need to get done.
All of these have something in common. They're tasks. They're things you need to get done. I need to do my homework. I need to do the dishes. I still have to do the laundry. These are all things you're responsible for. They're part of your routine.
Yeah. And notice how natural that sounds. You're not creating anything. You're just completing tasks. And I think this is where a lot of learners make mistakes, because they try to replace do with make, thinking it will sound more advanced or more precise.
Yeah, like saying, make homework, make the dishes, which sounds really strange.
Exactly. Because again, it's not about sounding advanced. It's about using the verb that naturally fits the situation.
Let's imagine a simple conversation. What are you doing today?
I have to do some homework, then I'll do the dishes, and after that, I need to do a bit of work.
Yeah, that sounds completely natural, very simple, but very real.
Now imagine saying, I have to make my homework, then I'll make the dishes.
Yeah, I understand, but it sounds very off. So this is a really important pattern to notice. Do plus tasks.
Yeah. And once you internalize that, a lot of decisions become automatic. Let's add a few more. I need to do my job properly. She did all the cleaning this morning. I'm going to do some work later.
And here's something interesting too. You can also say do something like, I need to do something today. Let's do something fun this weekend.
Yeah. And that's very flexible. It can refer to almost anything. And I think this is where do becomes really powerful, because it's a very general verb. It doesn't need to be specific. It just carries the idea of action.
Exactly, and that's why it's so common in everyday speech. It's simple, flexible, and natural. So if you want to start using this more naturally, try describing your day using do. Think about your routine and say, I need to do this. I have to do that.
Yeah. And the more you repeat that, the more natural it becomes. All right, so that's do. And hopefully that's starting to feel a bit clearer.
Yeah. Now, let's move to the other side, because this is where things get really interesting. All right, so now let's shift to the other side of this. Because if do is about tasks and actions, then make is where things start to feel a bit more creative or result-oriented. And I think this is where learners sometimes get confused. Because the idea of creating something is not always obvious.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it gets tricky, because sometimes you are creating something physical, like food or an object, but other times you're creating something more abstract, like a decision or a mistake, or even a situation. So, in a very general sense, make is used when something is being created, produced, or brought into existence, even if it's not something you can touch.
Yeah. And that's a really important point, because a lot of people think make is only for physical things, but it's much broader than that. Let's start with some obvious ones. Make a cake, make dinner, make a sandwich. Here, it's very clear. You are creating something.
Yeah, and those are easy to understand. But now, let's move to something slightly less obvious. We also say, make a decision, make a mistake, make money. And here, nothing physical is being created in the same way, but something is still being produced.
Exactly, a decision didn't exist, and now it does. A mistake didn't exist, and now it does. Money wasn't there, and now it is. And I think this is where learners start to see the pattern more clearly. It's not about memorizing each expression separately. It's about understanding the type of action behind the verb.
Yeah, and once you start seeing that pattern, it becomes easier to predict what sounds natural, even in new situations.
Let's imagine a simple conversation again. What are you doing tonight?
I'm going to make dinner. Then I need to make a decision about a project I'm working on.
Yeah, that sounds very natural. You're using make in two different ways, but both feel completely correct.
Now imagine saying, I'm going to do dinner. Then I need to do a decision.
Yeah, that sounds really strange.
And this is where the contrast becomes very clear. Because with do, you're performing a task, but with make, you're producing something.
Exactly. Do equals execute. Make equals create. Even if it's something abstract.
Let's add more natural examples. I made a mistake yesterday. She made a really good decision. They made a lot of money last year.
And all of these sound completely natural, and you'll hear them all the time in conversations.
A very common mistake is mixing these up, especially in expressions that you haven't seen many times.
Yeah, like do a mistake, do a decision.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
So again, This is not about intelligence. It's not about your level. It's about exposure. The more you hear these combinations, the more natural they become. So if you want a simple way to practice this, try to think about things you create in your day, decisions, plans, food, results, and describe them using make.
Yeah, like, I need to make a plan. I made a mistake. I'm going to make dinner. All right, so now we've looked at both sides. Do and make.
And hopefully you're starting to feel the difference. Not just understand it.
So now, let's bring everything together and look at some direct comparisons. All right, so now that we've looked at do and make separately, this is where everything really starts to come together, because understanding them individually is helpful. But what really builds confidence is seeing them side by side, in similar situations, so you can actually feel the difference.
Yeah, exactly, because this is where learners usually hesitate. Not when they're studying, but in real conversations. When they need to choose quickly between do and make, and they don't have time to think about rules.
Right. And that's why repetition and comparison are so important here, because the goal is not to think, the goal is to recognize.
Let's start with something very common. Do homework. Make a mistake. So here, you're doing homework. You're completing a task, but you're making a mistake. You're producing a result.
Yeah, and that contrast is really important. Homework is something you do. A mistake is something that happens because of you. Let's imagine a situation. I stayed home last night. I had to do my homework. And honestly, I made a few mistakes.
Yeah, that sounds completely natural. And notice how both verbs appear in the same sentence. But they serve different roles. Let's try another one. Do the dishes, make dinner. So here, both are actions. But they're different types of actions.
Yeah. Do the dishes is a task. It's something repetitive, something you need to take care of. But make dinner, you're actually creating something.
Let's imagine a conversation at home. What are you doing right now?
I'm making dinner, but I still have to do the dishes later.
Yeah, that sounds completely natural. And again, both verbs appear naturally in the same context.
Now here's another interesting contrast. Do something, make something, both exist, but they feel very different.
Yeah, do something is very general. It doesn't say exactly what you're doing. It just means some kind of action.
But make something implies that you're creating something specific.
So for example, I want to do something this weekend. That could be anything. Go out, relax, travel. It's open.
But if you say, I want to make something this weekend, now it sounds like you're planning to create something. Maybe food, maybe a project, something more specific. And this is where you start to feel the difference instead of just understanding it, because the verbs don't just change the structure, they change the meaning and the intention.
Let's go through some of the most common mistakes and correct them in a natural way. I did a mistake. I made a mistake.
I made my homework. I did my homework.
I did a decision. I made a decision.
I made the dishes. I did the dishes.
Let's do a quick role play to make this more real. How was your day?
It was busy. I had to do a lot of work. Then I made dinner, and later I made a decision about a project.
Yeah, that sounds completely natural.
It was busy. I made a lot of work. Then I did dinner, and later I did a decision.
Yeah, I understand everything, but it sounds strange. And I think this is the most important takeaway here. Understanding is not the same as sounding natural.
Yeah, and the goal is to close that gap, to move from people understand me to this sounds like real English. All right, so now that we've seen all these examples,
let's bring everything together and make it practical.
all right. So before we finish, I think this is a really good moment to pause for a second and just look at everything we covered today in a simple way, because we talked about a lot of examples. But the goal is not to memorize everything. It's to start recognizing patterns.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you try to remember every single expression, it can feel overwhelming. But if you understand the general idea, then everything starts to connect. So very simply, do gives tasks, activities, things you complete. Make gives create, produce, generate something.
Yeah, And that idea is not perfect, but it helps guide you in the right direction.
All right, let's make this a bit more interactive. We're going to do a quick exercise together.
Yeah. And if you're watching this, try to answer before we say the answer.
Okay? First one. I need to my homework.
The answer is, do my homework.
Yeah, because it's a task.
Next one, she. A big mistake.
Made a mistake. Because it's something that was created. A result. All right, next I have to the dishes.
Do the dishes. Again, task, routine. Next one, I'm going to dinner tonight.
Make dinner, because you're creating something, okay? One more. I need to a decision.
Make a decision. Because again, you're producing something new. And if you noticed, all of these follow the same pattern we talked about.
Yeah, and that's the goal, not memorizing but recognizing. So if you take one thing from this episode, let it be this. Don't try to guess randomly. Start noticing patterns.
Yeah. And the more you hear real English, the easier it becomes to choose naturally. Because natural English is not about knowing more words.
It's about using them the way people actually do.
All right, that's it for today.
Yeah. This one was really practical.
And if you practice this, you'll start noticing a difference very quickly.
Exactly. So don't just watch, try it.
And we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, guys.